When the lawyer said my name, it felt like someone had turned the room upside down and let the pieces fall where they wanted. For a second, my mind refused the sound. The syllables bent oddly with the weight of paper and ink and 2 centuries of money. Then silence folded into itself, and the people around me became a single blur. Faces drained pale, a muffled intake of breath. The small gasp that happens when everyone realizes the world has rerouted. All assets and holdings shall be transferred to Sophia Reed. The phrase landed like a verdict. Grandfather Elias had been the kind of man who took space in the world like a building. His name belonged to bridges, to tracts of land, to paperwork with more pages than my entire life's receipts. People who knew him called him a builder. People who profited from him called him a genius. I had been his granddaughter who shelved books, tutored children in the afternoon, and thought my world was small and good enough. That morning my quiet life appended into an estate bigger than I could imagine, holdings layered and nested across trust. Foundations, private companies, ships calculations that read like a language I never formally learned. The number they eventually said out loud felt like bad weather, $5 billion. It was not the sound of money in a bank. It was the word for an impossible tide. I had 2 immediate instincts. One was disbelief. The other was a fist of cold clarity. My grandfather had been many things, but he had also been a man who noticed smallness, how a child's eyes lit up reading the right sentence. How a librarian can make a community feel like home. The will contained a short note in his cramped hand. Sophia, because you remember the small things. I clung to that sentence. Like someone under cold water holding a lungful of air. Family reaction was a predictably loud theater. My mother's face, usually composed like a well-made cake, cracked at the edges. My aunt moved with the precision of someone who'd already begun to calculate. Cousins who never visited my library sent messages that smelled like new suits and quick congratulations. Lawyers materialized like birds at a market. The world outside my quiet life opened its beak and peered in. I could have run, or I could have handed the keys off to the nearest suited advisor and returned to my shelves. For a sliver of a breath, I considered both. Then another truth took shape. My grandfather had not left me the keys simply to cash a check. The will was layered. The transfers came with conditions, with stewardship clauses demanding community investments and long-term commitments. He had left commands and expectations with the kind of engineer's mind that plans for centuries. He hadn't wanted money squandered. He wanted a legacy, one that required someone who would care about small things as fiercely as they would manage large accounts. The first week after the reading was a classroom, of people teaching me their intentions. Stockbrokers spoke like men reciting prayers. Politicians sent tentative letters that read more like job applications. Financial managers offered strategic partnerships. My inbox became a river of hands wanting to be clasped, of opinions on how to convert the estate into an empire that fit their particular appetite. And then there was family. The family that once accepted me with mild fondness now circled like vultures learning the new wind. My aunt filed the first formal challenge, alleging confusion in my grandfather's final weeks. My cousins muttered about fiduciary duty as if the law were a scalpel to carve the inheritance into pieces that suited them. My mother shifted between pleading with me to keep things quiet and dignified, and furious whispers about how this would affect her life plans. I do not tell you this to make them villains on a stage. Family greed is not melodrama. It is a set of small justifications stitched into habit. The difference here was that the money made habit into strategy. The choice before me split into 2 tracks. One was the easy track: hire a team, sign the papers. Let professionals turn the holdings into manageable portfolios. Distribute polite philanthropic donations. And publish a press release that left no one embarrassed. The other was the hard track: investigate. Uncover and decide whether an empire built over decades had been constructed cleanly, or if dark pockets of extraction had been hidden beneath the facade of job creation and development. I chose the second because when someone leaves you everything so casually in a world built on obfuscation, it is either a redemptive errand or a trap. Grandfather Elias had always been meticulous. He did not trust public applause. I had discovered notes tucked in the will lists. Small actualities, handwritten reminders to check particular trusts, to audit particular nonprofits, to inquire about a set of leases that never quite matched the books. It looked to me like he had built in a test. Could the heir he named carry the estate without making it into predation? So I started to read. Not the glossy broker overviews, but the dusty notarized appendices. I went to meetings not with the people with most influence, but with those who had been most affected by Ilias's projects, small business owners, former factory workers, neighbors who'd watched neighborhoods change. I remembered why he had once lingered in the children's section of my library and why that memory mattered. A man who could understand the worth of a page could not have been blind to the cost of displacement. The financial trail bent in directions that made my jaw tighten. There were property acquisitions cloaked under shell companies, environmental remediation fees that had seemingly been paid and then recouped through subcontractors connected to holding companies we were advised to overlook. There were donations to foundations whose purpose was unclear and which channeled funds into private accounts. None of this was illegal in a single obvious line. It was a patchwork of legal structures that looked from the inside, like a machine designed to protect profit and minimize transparency. I could have gone public. I could have hired a PR firm and made a theater of moral clarity. I refused. Instead, I built a small team, an honest auditor, a lawyer who smelled faintly of paper, and a community organizer who could read a lease like scripture. We made agreements and we made plans. We also began to push for openness, annual stewardship reports, a public accounting of philanthropic outcomes, and an insistence that any redevelopment projects include binding clauses that preserved affordable housing. This is the moment you expect the fight scene, the shouting at the boardroom table, the dramatic revelations in a late-night hearing. There were moments like that. But the real battles became a series of small, precise strikes, filing motions, refusing a seemingly generous sale from a private equity firm that wanted to strip assets for short-term gain, exposing irregular contracts that had been hidden under layers of bookkeeping. Each move was strategic, less about spectacle than about closing cracks. My aunt's challenge reached a courtroom. She argued incapacity, undue influence, that my grandfather had been imperfect in his last days. They called doctors and they called acquaintances who said they had seen moments of forgetfulness. We countered with letters Elias had written over the preceding year's notes on projects, small lists for the librarian, memos about a trust to protect neighborhood businesses. The judge listened to handwriting exhibits with the weariness of someone who had seen many families try to relitigate the dead. When the judge upheld the will, something shifted. It wasn't an apocalyptic victory. It was an authorization. I had the legal right and the moral responsibility to steward. I didn't take it as triumph. I took it as a call to work. What followed was a season of saying no a lot. No to fast money. No to privatization of public assets. No to proposals that sounded like philanthropy but functioned as tax shelters. I fought for binding agreements that ensured funding for local schools, that required contractors to hire within the community, that turned some redevelopment projects into co-op ownership models rather than luxury towers that displaced the old neighborhoods. Some fights cost us time. Some cost us relationships. A few cost us potential capital. It lost a niece to the allure of quick profit. She took a role on a management team that promised exponential returns. She no longer called on Sundays. My mother spoke to me less often, embarrassed that the family's private life had become a matter of public debate. The cousins who had once sent friendly messages saw the estate as a ledger to be refilled. Some relationships never recovered. But the neighbors did. The small business owners whose roofs we repaired. The children in the refurbished community center reading under warm light. These were the quiet proofs that what I had inherited was not only money, but leverage to mend. People will tell you I was naive, that I inherited an empire and squandered opportunity by being moral. To them I say, an empire built on extraction reproduces extraction. My stewardship did not erase the past, but it interrupted the pattern. We set up transparent stewardship reports published for anyone to read. We redirected funds into durable community trusts rather than into vanity projects. We created accountable partnerships that kept decision-making near the people affected. The climax of all this was not a courtroom or a headline. It was the day the first grant went out to Restore, a small manufacturing workshop that had once employed dozens and had been shuttered in favor of a glass tower. The grant required that rehiring would prioritize local residents, include training, and protect wages. The factory's reopening was not a parade. It was a series of careful check-ins, legal steps, and patient work. But when the doors opened and the machines hummed again with local hands on the levers, something simple and enormous settled. People could work in their neighborhood without being priced out of it. A year in, we had transformed some narratives. Not all. The estates still had lawyers and 1,000 decisions waiting like chess pieces. I still had nights where the weight of dollars felt like a cold tide under my ribs. But I had also learned how leverage works. You can either use it to take or you can use it to shore up. I chose the latter because my grandfather's last sentence, "You remember the small things," reminded me of the difference between spectacle and stewardship. When I walk into the library now, closed after an afternoon of children's programs and a small board meeting to review stewardship notes, I sometimes pause and think about the absurd path my life had taken. From late fees and bookmarks to boardrooms and trustees, the terrain had changed. But some things remained sacred. The quiet joy of a child discovering a sentence that changes how they think. The precise thank you note of a community leader whose roof no longer leaks. The small face of a neighbor returning to work. I will not pretend the moral path was easy. It demanded me to be smaller sometimes and larger at others, to hold boundaries that cost me kin and to withstand opportunists who called themselves friends. But the thing that steadied me in the end was not the file named $5 billion estate, nor the legal rulings, nor the newspaper headlines. It was the ledger of little things, the list of names Elias had carefully written down for preservation, the memory of him standing in the children's section and calling quietly to the books he could not buy, the way he had once, at a small reception, paused to listen to a woman talk about a scholarship. Money can build enormous things, but money can also buy silence. My work, perhaps the only meaningful use of what I'd inherited, was to turn all of that noise into a structure that kept small voices audible. I inherited more than property, I inherited choice. And when people asked why I refused to cash out or to hand the estate to the highest bidder, I answered simply, I was not elected to be its richest caretaker. I was entrusted to be its steadiest steward. If my grandfather's final act was a secret, maybe it was this: he believed the right person could remember what mattered. I honored that trust by remembering.